Varus, give me back my legions. They trust me. That is enough. No! Rest! Forward rest! It's just another rebellion. They were not marching to battle. They were walking into a grave. 3 legions after that day. Rome trusted. After that day, Rome never crossed the Rhine again. The forest did not defeat Rome, trust did.
There is a moment, somewhere between midnight and the gray hours before dawn, when even the most powerful man alive can become completely undone, not by an enemy army at the gates, not by an assassin's blade, but by a single piece of news, carried on horseback across hundreds of miles, that arrives in the palace and refuses to become untrue, no matter how many times you read it. That moment came to the Emperor Augustus in the autumn of 9th AD, according to the Roman historian Suetonius, writing in his landmark work. The 12 Caesars, roughly a century after these events, the Emperor of Rome did something that no one in his court had ever seen before, and that no one would ever forget. He stood in his palace on the Palatine Hill, the man who had defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the man who had transformed a crumbling republic into the mightiest empire the world had ever known, the man whose image was stamped on every coin from Britain to Egypt. And he walked headfirst into the walls. Again and again, he let his beard and hair grow untrimmed for months, a profound act of a public mourning that Romans reserved only for the most catastrophic losses. And in the nights that followed, alone or surrounded by servants who dared not speak, he would cry out into the darkness, the same desperate words over and over again. Quintilivare legiones red. Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions. Those words, recorded by Suetonius and echoed by the historian Cassius Dio in his own account, written in the early 3rd century, have traveled across 2,000 years and arrived here, still carrying every ounce of their original anguish. They are not the words of a general processing a battlefield setback. They are the words of a man who has just understood that something he believed to be permanent, something he believed to be invincible, something he had given his entire life to building, was not what he thought it was. September 9 AD, in a dense, rain-soaked forest in the region, the Romans called Germania, somewhere near what is today the Kalkries Hill in Lower Saxony. Germany, 3 entire Roman legions ceased to exist. Legio XVII, Legio XVIII, and Legio XIX, somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 men in total, including their commanders, their auxiliaries, their cavalry, and the servants and families who had followed the column into the trees were ambushed, surrounded and systematically destroyed over the course of 3 days. Their sacred standards, the legionary eagles, the golden aquila that represented the very soul and honor of a Roman military unit, were captured. Their commander, the Roman governor Publius Quinctilius Varus, fell upon his own sword rather than be taken alive. It was not merely a military defeat. Rome had suffered military defeats before. It had lost battles and then came back and won the wars. But this was something different. This was the destruction of an illusion that Rome had been building for decades. The illusion that Germania east of the Rhine was already a Roman province in everything but name, already tamed, already pacified, already integrated into the eternal order of the empire. In a single autumn week, that illusion was stripped away completely. And the man responsible for stripping it away was not some foreign king. He was not a Parthian general or a Numidian chieftain who had never set foot in Rome. He was a man who had grown up within the Roman system, who had eaten at Roman tables, worn Roman armor, spoken Latin as fluently as any, senator's son, and earned the rank of eques, the Roman knightly order, placing him firmly within the highest levels of Roman society. His name, as the Romans recorded it, was Arminius. His people called him something closer to Herman, and Rome had trusted him completely. This is not a story about a battle. This is a story about what happens when an empire mistakes familiarity for loyalty and trust for control. If you have ever placed your trust in someone who knew your vulnerabilities better than anyone else, and then watched that trust be turned against you, you already understand the emotional core of what happened in the Teutoburg Forest. It is the oldest of all human betrayals, scaled to the size of an empire. And 2,000 years later, it still lands with the same force. Because some truths about power and loyalty and the danger of assumption do not change with the centuries. So let us go back. Let us go back to the beginning of this story, because the disaster in that forest did not begin with a rainstorm and an ambush. It began years earlier in a decision that seemed at the time like wisdom and ended up being one of the most catastrophic miscalculations. In the history of Western civilization, the Roman Empire, at the moment our story begins, was at the height of its confidence. Augustus, born Gaius Octavius, later known as Octavian before the Senate, granted him the honorific title of Augustus in 27 BC, had spent 4 decades transforming Rome from a republic, torn apart by civil war, into the most administratively sophisticated empire the ancient world had ever produced. He had reformed the legions, reorganized the provincial system, rebuilt the city of Rome in marble, where he had inherited it in brick, and presided over a period of relative peace. The Pax Romana, that would become the standard against which all subsequent periods of stability were measured. But Augustus was also a man with a frontier problem. To the east of the Rhine River, the Germanic tribes occupied a vast, forested territory that refused to behave as a conquered province should. Rome had been pushing eastward since the campaigns of Julius Caesar and his successors, and by the last decade before the Common Era, Roman legions had established forts and administrative centers stretching from the Rhine toward the Elbe. There were Roman towns of significance east of the Rhine. Roman tax collectors were operating in the region. Roman law was being applied to Germanic disputes. The plan, as Augustus and his generals understood it, was proceeding. Germania was being Romanized. It was only a matter of time. In 7 AD, Augustus appointed Publius Quinctilius Varus as governor of the new proto-province of Germania. Varus was a man of considerable administrative experience. He had served as governor of Syria from roughly 6 to 4 BC, where he had demonstrated a talent for organization and taxation. He was also, as the Roman historian Velleius Paterculus noted, with barely concealed disapproval, more comfortable in a law court than on a battlefield. He had married into the imperial family, his wife being a grandniece of Augustus himself, which gave him political connections that more than compensated in the eyes of Rome's administrators for whatever he might lack in martial temperament. Varus arrived in Germania and proceeded to govern it as though it were Syria, which is to say, as though the people living there had already accepted Roman authority and were simply waiting for the machinery of Roman civilization to be installed. He imposed taxes. He insisted that Germanic disputes be settled according to Roman legal procedure. He treated the tribal nobility not as independent allies who had chosen to cooperate with Rome, but as subordinates who had been assigned their roles within the imperial system. Velleius Paterculus wrote with palpable contempt that Varus behaved as though he were a city praetor, dispensing justice in the Roman form, rather than a military governor, commanding 3 legions in the middle of a barely pacified wilderness. The Germanic tribes seethed, but they did not at first rebel, because among them there was a man who counseled patience, who assured them that the moment was not yet right, who smiled at Varus across the dinner table and told the governor that all was well, that the tribes were loyal, that Rome had nothing to fear. His name was Arminius, and in the chapters that follow, we are going to understand exactly who he was, how he came to stand in that forest, with a Roman sword at his side and a Germanic warband at his back, why he made the choice he made, and what the consequences of that choice were, not just for Rome, not just for the Germanic tribes, but for the entire future shape of European civilization. Because this story does not end in 9 AD. The echoes of what happened in that forest are still audible today. In the borders of modern nations, in the linguistic fault, lines that divide Romance language Europe from Germanic language. Europe in the cultural memory of nations that trace their identity back to the moment when Rome stopped and turned around. But first, we need to meet the man himself. We need to understand the world that made him, the empire that raised him, and the moment when he decided that everything he had been given by Rome was not enough to make him Roman. Somewhere in the territory of the Cheruscan tribe, in the forested highlands east of the Rhine River, in what is today the region of Lower Saxony in northern Germany, around the years 18 or 17 BC, a boy was born who would one day bring the Roman Empire to its knees. His father was Segimer, a chieftain of the Cherusci, one of the more significant Germanic tribes of the region. His mother's name is not recorded in any source that has survived to the present day, which is, in itself, a small reminder of how thoroughly ancient history filtered its accounts through the perspective of the powerful and the Roman. The Cherusci were not, by the standards of their era, an obscure or marginal people. They occupied a substantial territory bounded roughly by the Weser River to the east, the Harz Mountains to the south, and the Elbe to the northeast. They were organized like most Germanic tribes of the period, around a system of clans and noble families, whose authority rested on a combination of military reputation, inherited status, and the ability to forge and maintain alliances. Segemer was part of the Cherusci's Roman-friendly faction, which in the political geography of the late 1st century BC meant something quite specific. He was a man who had decided that accommodation with Rome was a more viable survival strategy than confrontation. That decision had consequences that his infant son would spend his entire life living with. The Romans had a practice that functioned simultaneously as a diplomatic instrument, a security guarantee, and a cultural weapon. When a tribe or a kingdom reached an accommodation with Rome, when it accepted federated status or treaty obligations, the Romans would frequently require that the sons of the leading noble families be sent to Rome as hostages. The Latin word for this arrangement was obsides. And while the translation hostage carries connotations of captivity and coercion, the reality was considerably more nuanced and, in certain respects, considerably more sinister. These young men were not kept in dungeons. They were not treated as prisoners. They were integrated into Roman aristocratic life. They were given tutors. They learned Latin. They attended the same schools as the sons of Roman senators. They wore Roman clothing, participated in Roman religious ceremonies, ate Roman food, and were gradually systematically immersed in the Roman worldview until, for many of them, the forest and the tribe and the father who had sent them away became a distant, half-remembered thing, while Rome became the only reality that felt entirely real. This was the genius of the system and its cruelty. Rome did not merely take hostages. Rome took children and rebuilt them from the inside. The Cherusci became Roman vassals around 12 BC, when the Roman general Drusus, the stepson of Augustus, conducted a series of campaigns that pushed Roman influence deep into Germanic territory. As part of the treaty obligations that followed, Segemer surrendered his 2 sons. The elder was Arminius. The younger was a boy who would be known in Roman records by the Latinized name Flavus, meaning the fair-haired one. Both boys were taken west across the Rhine toward Rome. We do not know precisely how old they were. The ancient sources do not give us that detail, but based on the standard Roman practice of taking children between roughly 7 and 12 years of age, and working backward from what we know of Arminius's subsequent career, it is reasonable to estimate that he arrived in Rome somewhere around 10 to 8 BC, as a boy of perhaps 7 or 8 years old. Think about what that means for a moment. A child from a world of forests and rivers and tribal councils, of timber longhouses and firelight and the smell of pine and river mud, arriving for the first time in a city of perhaps 1 million people, the largest city on earth, a city of marble and noise and crowds and ambition, where the streets were paved with black basalt, and the water ran through stone pipes in the walls of buildings, where the forum was lined with temples whose columns reached higher than any tree he had ever seen, where the roar of the Circus Maximus on a race day could be heard a mile away. This was not merely impressive. It was reality-altering. It was, in the most literal possible sense, a demonstration that Rome was operating on an entirely different scale of existence than anything he had previously known. And that, of course, was precisely the point. Arminius and his brother Flavus received a Roman military education. The Roman historian Velleius Paterculus, writing in his Compendium of Roman History, around 30 AD, provides us with one of the most vivid surviving descriptions of the young Arminius. He calls him a young man of noble birth, brave in action, and alert in mind, possessing an intelligence quite beyond the ordinary barbarian. That last phrase tells us something important, not only about Arminius, but about the lens through which Roman historians viewed Germanic people generally, a lens we need to keep in mind, even as we recognize that the underlying observation about Arminius's exceptional intelligence was almost certainly accurate. The education Arminius received was the education of the Roman military class. He learned Latin, and not merely conversational Latin, but the precise formal Latin of legal documents, military dispatches, and senatorial debate. He learned the Roman system of military organization, the structure of the legion, the roles of the various officers from the lowly optio up through the centurion, the tribune, the prefect, and the legate. He learned Roman tactics, the testudo formation, the use of artillery, the principles of camp construction, the logic of Roman road building, and its relationship to military logistics. He learned, in other words, exactly how the Roman war machine worked from the inside. He also received the rank of eques, the equestrian order, which was the second tier of Roman aristocratic status, ranking below the senatorial class, but far above ordinary citizens. This was not a courtesy title. It carried genuine social and legal weight. It placed Arminius in the formal hierarchy of Roman society above the vast majority of people he would encounter in his daily life. It gave him access to social circles, official functions, and military commands that would have been closed to him without it. Rome was telling him, through every one of these gestures, you belong here. You are one of us. The forest you came from is the past. This marble and law and order and civilization, this is the future, and you are part of it. His brother Flavius seems to have accepted this framing entirely and permanently. He remained loyal to Rome throughout his life and continued to serve in the Roman military even after the disaster of Teutoburg, even after the battle in which his own brother orchestrated the destruction of 3 Roman legions. The two brothers reportedly came face to face across the Weser River during Germanicus's later campaigns in 15 AD, separated by the water and by everything else, and reportedly exchanged bitter words about loyalty and betrayal and what it meant to be Cherusci. Flavius, by that point, had lost an eye fighting for Rome. He apparently felt the sacrifice was worthwhile. Arminius did not. Around 1 AD, Arminius was sent with a detachment of Cherusci auxiliary cavalry to participate in the Pannonian and Illyrian campaigns, the major Roman military operations on the Balkan Peninsula that are collectively known as the Great Illyrian Revolt. These campaigns, which ran from roughly 6 to 9 AD in their most intense phase, but drew on forces that had been building since earlier, were among the most demanding and brutal military operations that Rome undertook during the Augustan period. Suetonius described them as the most difficult wars Rome had faced since the Punic Wars against Carthage. Arminius served in these campaigns between approximately 1 and 6 AD. He commanded the Cherusci auxiliary forces alongside Roman legions. He fought in conditions that were, if anything, even more geographically demanding than the Germanic forests. He had grown up near the rugged terrain of the Balkans, the guerrilla tactics of the Illyrian and Pannonian tribes, the logistical nightmare of supplying armies across mountain passes and through marshlands. He performed well enough to be formally recognized. He was confirmed in his rank as a Roman citizen and officer of the equestrian order. His military commission was validated through actual combat command, not merely through the courtesy of the courts. He learned in the field what the difference was between Roman military doctrine as taught in the training schools of Rome and Roman military doctrine as it actually functioned or failed to function when confronted with difficult terrain, extended supply lines, and an enemy that refused to fight on Roman terms. This last lesson would prove to be the most important of all, because what Arminius was learning in those Balkan mountains and river valleys was not just how to fight for Rome. He was learning exactly where Rome could be broken. The Roman legion was, in open terrain, virtually unstoppable. Its combination of disciplined infantry formations, heavy defensive armor, standardized weaponry, and tactical flexibility had allowed Rome to defeat every major enemy it had faced in the open field for generations. But the legion was not equally invincible in all environments. It was designed for a world of roads, clear sightlines, and open ground where its formations could function as designed. In dense forests, on narrow paths hemmed in by trees and bogs, with an enemy that could strike and disappear and reappear without warning, the very qualities that made the legion magnificent in the open field became liabilities. The heavy armor slowed movement in mud. The formations required space to function that forests did not provide. The communication systems, the horns and drums and runners that coordinated legion movements, became ineffective when sound was absorbed by dense vegetation, and runners could not move quickly through undergrowth. The supply wagons and artillery that gave Roman armies their logistical advantages in conventional warfare became millstones in narrow forest paths. Arminius had seen all of this. He had thought about all of this. And by the time he returned to Germania around 7 AD, assigned to serve under the new governor Publius Quinctilius Varus, he carried inside him a blueprint that no Roman commander could have imagined. precisely because no Roman commander had been trained to think about the empire's military from the outside. There is a question that historians have debated for 2,000 years, and that deserves to be addressed here directly, because it goes to the heart of what makes this story both historically important and humanly compelling. When did Arminius decide to turn against Rome? Was it a decision he arrived at slowly, over years of growing disillusionment? Was it a response to specific provocations by Varus and the harshness of Roman taxation? Was it something he had always carried inside him? A loyalty to his people that Rome's generosity had never quite managed to extinguish? The ancient sources do not give us a clear answer, and the honest response to that uncertainty is to acknowledge it, rather than to invent a conversion narrative that fits our dramatic preferences. What the sources do tell us is this: Arminius returned to Germania and took up his position as a trusted advisor and auxiliary commander under Varus. He was, by all accounts, convincingly loyal in his public behavior. He dined at Varus's table. He provided intelligence about the tribes. He reassured the governor when others counseled caution. Velleius Paterculus, who was serving in the Roman military during this period, and claims to have met Arminius personally, described him in terms of unmistakable admiration, without a single hint that he suspected anything. What we do know is that by the summer of 9 AD, Arminius had secretly assembled an alliance of at least several Germanic tribes, including his own Cherusci, the Bructeri, the Marsi, and others. This was a remarkable diplomatic achievement in itself, given that these tribes had their own rivalries and histories of conflict with one another. Uniting them, even temporarily, against a common enemy required exactly the kind of political intelligence and personal persuasiveness that Arminius had spent his entire adult life developing inside, the very empire he was now preparing to destroy. There was at least one man who knew what was coming and tried to warn Varus. His name was Segestes, a Cherusci chieftain, and in a biographical detail that adds another layer of personal complexity to this already complex story, the father of Thusnelda, the woman Arminius, had either married or was in the process of claiming against her father's wishes. Segestes warned Varus directly. He warned him at a banquet explicitly. He told the governor that Arminius was plotting a revolt and that Varus should arrest both Arminius and Segestes himself and investigate the matter thoroughly. Varus did not believe him. He could not make himself believe that the man who had eaten at his table, who spoke perfect Latin, who held a Roman military commission, who had served the empire with distinction for years, was capable of such a thing. Tacitus, writing his Annals in the early 2nd century, records that Varus dismissed the warnings as the product of personal enmity between Segestes and Arminius, likely related to the dispute over Thusnelda. This was not stupidity exactly. It was something more psychologically interesting and more universally recognizable. It was the inability of a confident man to update his model of the world when the evidence demanded it. Varus had a working theory of his situation in Germania. The province was pacified. The tribes were cooperative. Arminius was loyal. Segestes' warnings did not fit that theory, and so the theory survived intact, and the warnings were set aside. Trust once given is extraordinarily resistant to revision. That is one of the most human of all cognitive vulnerabilities. And in the summer and early autumn of 9 AD, it was about to cost Rome somewhere between 15 and 20,000 lives. By late summer, everything was in place. The legions were preparing to march from their summer camp on the upper Weser River back to their winter quarters near Vetera on the Rhine. It was a march they had made before, along established routes through territory that felt familiar. But reports arrived of a minor tribal uprising to the northwest. The reports required investigation and, if necessary, suppression. Arminius volunteered to guide the column. He knew a route, he told Varus, that would allow them to deal with the disturbance efficiently and still reach the Rhine before the winter closed in. The route would take them northwest, through the Teutoburg highlands, through narrow passes, where the hills descended toward the great bog-filled lowlands of the North German plain. It was not, he assured Varus, a difficult route. He had traveled it himself. What Arminius did not say, what he had arranged over months of secret meetings and careful preparation, was that at several points along that route, behind earthwork ramparts constructed with deliberate skill among the trees, thousands of Germanic warriors from multiple tribes were already in position and waiting. He excused himself from the column shortly after the march began telling Varus he was riding ahead to rally allied auxiliaries. Varus let him go without hesitation. Why would he not? Arminius was his trusted advisor, his Roman knight, the man who had sat across from him at dozens of dinners and told him each time that Germania was quiet. The column moved into the trees. The forest closed around it. The rains began. And somewhere ahead in the darkness between the oaks, the man Rome had spent 20 years building into the perfect Roman officer turned his horse around, rode back toward his people, and became again fully and finally Cherusci. There is a particular kind of blindness that does not come from ignorance. It comes from confidence. It comes from a man who has spent his entire career being right, being respected, and being rewarded, and who has therefore stopped asking himself the questions that might make him uncomfortable. It is a blindness that affects the competent and the powerful in equal measure, and it is far more dangerous than ordinary ignorance, because it wears the face of experience and carries the credentials of success. Publius Quinctilius Varus was not a stupid man. Let us be clear about that from the beginning, because the temptation to dismiss him as a fool is both historically unfair and intellectually lazy. He was a man of considerable achievement. He had governed Syria, one of the most administratively complex and politically volatile provinces in the empire, for approximately 2 years between 6 and 4 BC, and he had governed it well enough to satisfy Augustus, which was not an easy thing to do. He had handled the turbulent aftermath of the death of Herod the Great with a combination of military force and political calculation that, while it involved some brutal suppression of revolts in Judea, demonstrated a man capable of decisive action under pressure. He had married into the imperial family. He had the confidence of the most powerful man in the world. And in the autumn of 9 AD, in the forest between the Weser River and the Rhine, every one of those accomplishments became a liability. When Augustus appointed Varus as governor of Germania in 7 AD, the appointment was not, in Roman eyes, a gamble. It was a rational administrative decision. The situation in Germania, as Rome's leadership understood it, required an administrator more than a general. The difficult military work of pushing Roman influence east of the Rhine had been done by Drusus and Tiberius in the previous 2 decades. The legions had marched to the Elbe. The tribes had been subdued, or so it appeared. What was needed now was someone who could consolidate, organize, tax, and build. Someone who could transform a military occupation into a functioning province. Varus was exactly that kind of man. He arrived in the summer of 7 AD and proceeded, with the brisk efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, to begin governing Germania as though it were Syria. He held Roman legal proceedings in the field, settling disputes between Germanic tribesmen according to Roman law and Roman procedure. He introduced formal taxation, the tributum, which was not merely a financial demand, but a symbolic declaration that these people were now subjects of Rome, not allies or federates. He treated the Germanic nobility not as independent partners in a cooperative arrangement, but as subordinates who had been assigned their roles within the imperial framework and were expected to perform them accordingly. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century in his Roman History, captured the Germanic reaction with precision. He wrote that Varus treated the Germanic people as though they were already slaves, imposing taxes and levying charges as if they were a conquered people, rather than a proud warrior society that had maintained its independence by choice and by force of arms. Velleius Paterculus, who was considerably more sympathetic to Varus personally than Dio, nonetheless conceded that Varus committed the fundamental error of trying to accelerate a Romanization process that required time, patience, and above all, respect for the people being assimilated. The problem was structural as much as personal. Rome's method of provincialization had worked brilliantly in places like Gaul and Spain, where populations had been definitively defeated in major set-piece battles, had experienced decades of military occupation, and had gradually integrated into Roman economic and cultural life before being asked to accept Roman legal and financial authority. In those places, the imposition of Roman law and Roman taxes came after a long period of relationship building, after Roman merchants had brought trade goods and Roman culture had established roots, after the local elites had learned Latin and sent their sons to Rome and discovered that there were material advantages to cooperation. In Germania east of the Rhine in 7 AD, Essentially, none of those preconditions existed. The military campaigns of Drusus and Tiberius had demonstrated Roman power, but had not destroyed Germanic resistance. The tribes had accepted nominal Roman authority not because they were conquered, but because it was, for the moment, convenient. The moment Varus made clear that what Rome wanted was not cooperation but submission, that convenience evaporated. Among the Germanic leaders who attended Varus's dinner table, who advised him on tribal politics, who reassured him when disturbing reports arrived, the most important and the most trusted was Arminius. By 8 AD, Arminius had been back in Germania for approximately a year, and in that time, he had done something that required extraordinary patience, political skill, and an ability to manage multiple identities simultaneously without betraying any of them. The details of how Arminius assembled his coalition are not recorded in full in any surviving ancient source, which means that what follows involves some degree of inference from what we do know. What Cassius Dio, Tacitus, and Velleius Paterculus collectively confirm is this: by the late summer of 9 AD, Arminius had secured the cooperation of warriors from his own Cherusci tribe, from the Bructeri to the northwest, from the Marsi to the south, and from several other smaller groups. Scholarly estimates of the total Germanic force range from 12,000 to 20,000 men, though exact figures are impossible to verify from surviving sources. Building this coalition required Arminius to do several things simultaneously. He had to meet with tribal leaders in secret, which in a society where Roman informants and scouts were active, required careful management of time and movement. He had to persuade tribes that had their own histories of rivalry with the Cherusci to set those rivalries aside, at least temporarily, in the service of a shared goal. He had to inspire confidence that his plan, which depended on drawing a Roman army of 3 full legions into a specific geographic location on a specific date, would actually work. And he had to do all of this while continuing to present to Varus the convincing face of a loyal Roman officer. This last requirement was perhaps the most psychologically demanding. Think about what it required to sit across a table from a man who trusted you completely, to eat his food and drink his wine, to answer his questions about tribal politics, with enough truth to remain credible and enough misdirection to keep the real situation invisible, to watch him make decisions based on information you had carefully shaped to know that you were moving him step by patient step toward his destruction, all while showing nothing, all while smiling.
Whatever Arminius felt in those months, and the sources do not tell us, the performance was flawless. There was, as we noted briefly in the previous chapter, one man who saw through the performance. His name was Segestes, and his warning to Varus deserves to be examined in some detail, because it tells us as much about the psychology of Varus as it does about the politics of the Cherusci. Segestes was a Cherusci chieftain of the pro-Roman faction, which is to say, a man who had genuinely committed to cooperation with Rome and who believed that the long-term interests of the Cherusci were best served by that cooperation. His relationship with Arminius was complicated by more than politics. Arminius had taken, or was in the process of taking, Segestes' daughter Thesnelda as his wife, against her father's explicit wishes. Tacitus, in his Annals, records this detail, and it has led some ancient and modern commentators to suggest that Segestes' warnings to Varus were at least partly motivated by personal animosity toward Arminius. That may well be true. Human motivations are rarely pure, and a man who has watched his rival abduct his daughter and carry her off in defiance of his authority has reasons for hostility that go beyond political calculation. But the critical question is not what motivated Segestes to speak. The critical question is whether what he said was true. And it was. Tacitus tells us that Segestes warned Varus at a banquet, directly and explicitly, that Arminius was plotting a revolt. He urged Varus to arrest both Arminius and himself, Segestes, and to investigate the matter thoroughly. He was willing, in other words, to submit himself to Roman scrutiny to prove that his warning was genuine rather than a product of personal spite. This is not the behavior of a man simply trying to settle a score. This is a man who understood what was coming and was desperately trying to prevent it. Varus did not believe him. Cassius Dio tells us that Varus had formed such a high opinion of Arminius that he was beyond the reach of any accusation. Velleius Paterculus, who is our earliest surviving source and who may have met Varus personally, describes a man who was more ready to believe that which he wished were true than that which actually was true. This is one of the most precise psychological diagnoses in all of ancient historical literature. And it applies with devastating accuracy to what Varus did in the weeks that followed. He continued to trust Arminius. He continued to dismiss Segestes. He continued to believe that the province was secure, that the tribes were cooperative, that the warnings were the product of personal enmity. He continued to plan his march back to winter quarters on the Rhine exactly as he had planned marches in every previous year, with the full logistical train appropriate for a force moving through friendly territory. He even, according to Cassius Dio, weakened his force in the days before the march by sending detachments of soldiers out to various Germanic settlements that had requested Roman assistance with local matters. These soldiers were killed in their billets before the main attack began, precisely as Arminius had planned. By the time Varus's column entered the forest, it had already been reduced from its full strength. Its perimeter awareness degraded, its capacity for reconnaissance compromised. The summer of 9 AD was ending. The air over the Weser highlands was acquiring the first cool edge of early autumn. The Roman army, or the core of it that remained after the detachments had been sent away, was breaking down its summer camp somewhere on the upper Weser River, in the territory of the Bructeri. Archaeological work and analysis of Tacitus's later account of Germanicus's expedition to the battlefield in 15 AD suggest this camp was located in the general area of modern Minden, in northwestern Germany, though the precise location has not been confirmed by excavation. The plan was routine. The three legions, 17, 18, and 19, with their auxiliary infantry and cavalry units, their engineers, their medical staff, and their administrative officers, would march west and northwest toward their winter quarters near the Rhine. It was a march of roughly 150 to 200 miles, depending on the route, that the army had made before. What was not routine was the baggage. Cassius Dio is explicit on this point, and the archaeological evidence from Calcres confirms it. Varus marched with a column encumbered to a degree that was extraordinary, even by Roman standards, which already involved significant logistical trains on campaign. He brought heavy supply wagons. He brought personal servants and household staff. He brought, most remarkably, the families, the wives and children, and civilian dependents, of his officers and soldiers. Dio writes that they proceeded, as they would for a journey in peacetime, which is to say, with the relaxed and heavily loaded formation appropriate for a march through completely secured friendly territory. The total length of this column, based on calculations worked out by military historians, using Roman marching formations and accounting for cavalry, infantry, baggage, wagons, and camp followers, has been estimated at somewhere between 7 and 8 miles from the front of the advance guard to the rear of the baggage train. That is a column of living, moving humanity stretching nearly the distance of a modern half-marathon, strung out along paths that, as we will see, were barely wide enough for 2 wagons to pass abreast. At some point in the morning, when the march began, possibly September 8, according to the most careful modern reconstructions of the timeline, Arminius approached Varus and told him that he needed to ride ahead to rally allied auxiliary forces who were assembling in the territory to the northwest. He would rejoin the column in 2 or 3 days. Varus agreed without hesitation. Arminius rode away from the column. He did not ride northwest to find allies. He rode to the Germanic warbands that were already in position among the trees, and he told them that the time had come. The column entered the forest. The trees closed behind it. The sky darkened with the first clouds of the approaching storm. And in Rome, 2 weeks later, a man who had believed everything was under control sat alone in the silence of his palace on the Palatine Hill and began to understand what trust had cost him. There is a place in the lowlands of what is today northwestern Germany, north of the city of Osnabrück, near a village called Bramsch, where a hill called the Kalkreiser Berg rises to a modest 157 meters above the surrounding plain. To the south of the hill, the slope falls away through ravines and small stream beds to a narrow corridor of firm ground, no more than 220 meters wide at its most constricted point. To the north of that corridor, stretching for miles in every direction, lies one of the most extensive bog landscapes in Europe, the Grosses Moor. The Great Bog, a waterlogged expanse of peat and marsh grass that in the 1st century AD was utterly impassable for any significant body of people or animals. That corridor, that 220-meter wide strip of solid ground between hill and bog, is where what remained of 3 Roman legions was destroyed. The Varusschloss Museum and Park Kalkreis, established near the site in 2002, has recovered over 6,000 pieces of Roman military equipment from the surrounding ground, together with coins, personal effects, the bones of animals, and the skeletal remains of human beings. The coins include Augustan-era silver denarii stamped with the countermark VAR, the abbreviation of Varus, distributed by the governor to his troops for meritorious service. A silver cavalry parade mask, designed not for battle but for ceremonial display, was found face up in the earth. Archaeologists have excavated fragments of Lorica segmentata, the distinctive banded iron armor of the Roman legionary, including the most complete example of this armor type known from the early 1st century AD. They have found soldiers' sandal nails, surgical instruments, spoons, belt buckles, seal boxes, the small lead weights of a portable scale, and the finger rings, sized for women's hands, that confirm the presence of civilian dependents in the column. 2,000 years ago, all of these things belonged to living people. They were dropped, abandoned, stripped from the dead, or simply lost in the chaos of a disaster that unfolded over 4 days and left almost no survivors. The column had been moving for at least 1 day, possibly 2, before the first attack. According to Cassius Dio's account in Roman History, Book 56, the initial signs of trouble were not dramatic. The forest was dense, the paths were narrow, the soldiers at the front of the column had to work to clear fallen trees and bridge stream crossings. The pace was slow, the weather was turning. It is worth pausing here to appreciate what the march itself must have felt like, independently of any ambush, for the men in that column. Imagine a Roman legionary, carrying a pack that could weigh 40 to 60 pounds, including rations, armor, tools, and personal kit, moving in a line 6 men wide through a forest that grew so thick in places that the canopy blocked most of the daylight even at midday. The path beneath his feet was not a road. It was a cleared track at best, and in the lowlands, it crossed areas of boggy ground where the soil had the consistency of wet clay, where every step required effort and left behind a deep impression that the man behind him would have to navigate. The pace in these conditions was likely no more than 1 or 2 miles per hour. The column was already 7 or 8 miles long. The rear guard would still be in the morning's camp when the front guard had traveled only a few miles. Then Arminius made his move, not at the front of the column, where the military advance guard marched in reasonable fighting order. In the middle, where the baggage wagons and camp followers created a zone of maximum vulnerability. Cassius Dio describes the opening of the attack with the spare clarity of a man recounting a nightmare. The Germanic warriors, positioned on the slopes of the Kalkreiser Berg, and concealed behind a zigzagging rampart of packed sand and peat turf that archaeological excavations have confirmed, ran along the hillside, began their assault with volleys of javelins and arrows launched from elevated ground into the packed mass of men and animals below. Dio writes that at first they hurled their weapons from a distance, and, as no one defended himself and many were wounded, they approached closer. The key phrase is, "No one defended himself." This is not a commentary on Roman courage, which was considerable and well documented. It is a commentary on the impossibility of the tactical situation. A Roman soldier's defensive capability rested on his scutum, the large rectangular shield that could stop most projectile weapons. And that, when interlocked with those of the men beside him in the classic tortoise formation, created an almost impenetrable defensive wall. But the testudo required space, flat ground, and the ability to stop moving and orient together. In the middle of a 7-mile-long column squeezed onto a path through a forest, with wagons and terrified mules and screaming children on all sides, there was no space for formations. No flat ground to stand on, and no ability to stop moving without trapping everyone behind. The column's greatest logistical strength had become a death trap. To make the situation worse, the attack did not come only from above and ahead. Arminius had positioned warriors along multiple points of the column simultaneously, so that the ambush struck what the Romans experienced not as a battle with a defined front but as an attack from everywhere at once. The communication systems that normally coordinated Roman military response, the cornu horns, the deep bass signal of the bucina, the shouted commands relayed by optiones through the ranks, were partially absorbed by the forest, partially drowned by the wind and rain, and partially made irrelevant by the fact that command itself was fragmented. Officers at the rear of the column had no idea what was happening at the front. The front had no way to know the condition of the rear. Each section of the column became, in effect, its own isolated crisis. By the end of the first day, the column had not been destroyed, but it had been badly hurt, thoroughly disoriented, and stripped of its most fundamental military capability, the ability to act as a unified force. Varus ordered the construction of a marching camp, as Roman doctrine required when halting in potentially hostile territory. Tacitus, in his Annals, references this first camp, noting in his later account of Germanicus's return to the site that its wide circumference and the measurements of its central space clearly indicated the handiwork of 3 legions. The Romans still had the discipline and the engineering knowledge to build a proper fortified camp even after a day of ambush, which says something significant about the quality of the legionaries themselves, even under Varus. They dug the ditches, they raised the rampart, they set the watch. Outside the firelight, in the darkness between the oaks, the Germanic warriors melted back into the forest and waited. The following morning brought rain. Not a drizzle but a heavy, sustained downpour of the kind that the autumn climate of northwest Germany is fully capable of producing, a cold, Relentless rain that soaked through wool and leather and turned the forest floor from mud into something closer to a shallow river. Cassius Dio, whose description of the weather conditions at Teutoburg is one of the few specific environmental details in any ancient account of the battle, notes that the combination of rain and wind made movement extremely difficult and broke up the column's formation still further. The army needed to move. It could not stay where it was indefinitely. It was a military force designed to operate in motion, with supply lines that depended on movement and a strategic objective, reaching the Rhine, that required forward progress. Varus ordered the march to continue. The baggage wagons, heavy already with the equipment of 3 legions, were now even heavier with water-soaked canvas and supplies. And the mules that pulled them were struggling in the deepening mud. The soldiers, their shields, already swollen and heavier from water absorption, their sandals losing traction on the wet clay path, moved northwest, toward the Calcres corridor. This was exactly what Arminius needed them to do. He understood the terrain with a thoroughness that no Roman officer could match, because he had grown up in this land, because he had studied it deliberately, and because he had spent months preparing the killing ground that lay ahead. The narrow corridor between the Calcreser Berg and the Grosses Moor was the critical choke point, the place where the column's length, which had been a liability from the beginning, would become fatal. In that 220-meter wide passage, with the impassable bog to the north and the Germanic rampart to the south on the hillside, there was nowhere for the Romans to go except forward or backward, and both directions were covered. Archaeologists have excavated what appears to be the zigzagging Germanic rampart, constructed from peat turf and packed sand, running along the northern slope of the Calcreser Berg. The excavations at the site called the Oberisch, first professionally investigated in 1989 by a team led by Wolfgang Schluter and subsequently by Suzanne Wilbers-Rost, found the highest concentration of Roman military equipment in a tight zone immediately in front of the rampart line. This concentration, combined with the absence of finds behind the rampart, confirms the archaeological picture that Cassius Dio and other ancient sources describe the Romans came forward toward the rampart and could not get through it, while the Germanic warriors behind it could attack with relative safety. The combat on the second day was different in character from the first. The initial ambush had been a shock assault designed to cause maximum casualties and psychological disruption in minimum time. The fighting at the Calcres corridor was something more methodical. The Germanic warriors used the rampart as a base for repeated sorties, charging forward in small groups to drive into the Roman formation, inflicting casualties, and then withdrawing behind the earthwork before the Romans could bring their numbers to bear. Cassius Dio describes this pattern explicitly. The Germanic fighters would strike, then disappear, then strike again from a different point along the line. For the Roman officers trying to manage the situation, this was a tactical nightmare for which their training had prepared them very inadequately. Roman military doctrine, as developed over centuries of warfare in the Mediterranean world, assumed a fundamentally different kind of enemy. One that could be fixed in place, that would stand and fight in formation, that would respond to Roman tactical moves in predictable ways. The Germanic warriors at Teutoburg were doing none of those things. They were not trying to defeat the Roman legions in a set-piece engagement. They were trying to erode them, to exhaust them, to kill them piecemeal over time. To use the terrain and the weather and the psychological pressure of an enemy that could not be seen clearly and could not be brought to decisive battle. There is a term in modern military thinking for this kind of warfare: asymmetric attrition. The goal is not to overpower the enemy's strength, but to neutralize it, to find the conditions under which the enemy's advantages become irrelevant and your own advantages become decisive. Arminius had developed an approach to fighting Rome that was, in essence, the most sophisticated asymmetric strategy that any Germanic leader of his era had ever conceived. And it was working. By the end of the second day, the Roman cavalry had attempted to break out of the corridor and escape to the southwest, toward the Roman base at Haltern on the Lippe River, roughly 60 miles distant. Cassius Dio records that this breakout attempt failed. The cavalry found the terrain beyond the corridor no more navigable than the corridor itself. The combination of forest, bog, and Germanic warriors in the surrounding area making organized movement impossible. Most of them were killed or forced back. The Romans were enclosed. In the camp that night, Varus held a council of his senior officers. What was said at that council is not recorded in any surviving source. What followed from it is, the decision taken at that council was to burn or abandon most of the baggage train. Cassius Dio records this explicitly, and the logic is straightforward even if the execution must have been agonizing. The baggage that had been loaded for a peaceful march, the supply wagons, and the personal goods of officers and the possessions of camp followers, were physically preventing the army from moving with anything approaching military efficiency. The mules were dying in the mud. The wagons were blocking the path. The non-combatants accompanying the column were taking up space and requiring protection while contributing nothing to the army's fighting capacity. The burning of the baggage was a recognition, in the most concrete possible terms, that this was no longer a march. It was a fighting withdrawal, and it needed to be conducted as one. But it was also a recognition that came too late and in conditions that made effective execution nearly impossible. By the third day, the legions had already lost significant numbers to 2 days of ambush and combat. The weather had not improved. The terrain was unchanged, and Arminius had not stopped. Archaeological evidence from Calcres and the surrounding corridor suggests that the battle debris is distributed along approximately 15 miles from east to west, and 1.5 miles from north to south. This distribution tells us, in the language of material objects rather than words, that the Roman column did not fall apart in one place at one time. It fell apart gradually, over miles and days, with different sections of the column experiencing their own crises as the overall structure of the army disintegrated. Coins, armor fragments, weapons, personal items, they mark the path of the dying column like a trail of breadcrumbs, each object a point where someone stopped moving forever. The physical evidence also tells us something about the character of the men in that column, because among the objects recovered at Calcres are items that speak to professionalism maintained under impossible conditions. Surgical instruments that belonged to a medical officer who was still treating the wounded. A portable scale that belonged to a quartermaster or paymaster still trying to maintain administrative function. Seal boxes that held official documents. These were soldiers doing their jobs even as everything around them was collapsing. The Germanic attacks on the third day were more intense than on the previous two, because by this point, Arminius's forces were reinforced. Word of the Roman column's predicament had spread through the surrounding tribes, and additional warriors had joined the engagement. Drawn by the prospect of defeating Rome and, more practically, by the prospect of the plunder that a destroyed Roman military column would provide, Cassius Dio records that other tribes joined the attack as the days went on, which is consistent with the scale of the victory that the archaeological evidence documents. This was not a local ambush but a regional uprising coordinated around a single decisive opportunity. On what Cassius Dio describes as the fourth day of the fighting, the remnant of the Roman force, no longer organized as 3 legions, but surviving as whatever clumps of men had managed to stay together, found themselves in a final position that Tacitus later, through the account of Germanicus's visit to the site in 15 AD, described with haunting precision. There was a broad, roughly circular earthwork, clearly a Roman marching camp. Its dimensions consistent with the hasty fortification of a large but depleted force. Around it, the evidence of what happened next is scattered across the ground, weapons thrown aside or dropped, armor abandoned, the bones of men who died where they stood or fled and were caught in the trees. Varus held a final meeting with his senior officers. The accounts of Cassius Dio and Velleius Paterculus differ in some details about what precisely happened next, but they agree on the essential point. Understanding that there was no escape, that the legions were destroyed, that capture was inevitable for those who survived, Varus fell upon his own sword. Velleius Paterculus, who was deeply hostile to Varus's memory and blamed him comprehensively for the disaster, nonetheless recorded the fact of his suicide without obvious pleasure. It was, in the Roman tradition, the correct response to total military failure. Capture would have been the ultimate disgrace. His senior officers followed him into death. Cassius Dio notes that when the Germanic warriors broke into the final camp, the Roman commanders were already dead, not wishing to survive the disaster. Whether this was courage or despair or Roman calculation about the relative costs of death and captivity is something we cannot know from this distance. What happened to the men who survived, the soldiers who did not die in the fighting? Who did not fall on their swords with their officers, who were taken alive by the Germanic warriors? The sources are not detailed on this point, but they are not silent either. Tacitus, in his account of Germanicus's visit to the battlefield 6 years later, records what his men found when they reached the site: human skulls nailed to the trees of the surrounding forest. What Cassius Dio describes as barbarous altars were where prisoners had been sacrificed according to Germanic religious practice. Human heads nailed everywhere to trees, in Tacitus's account, translated in the Smithsonian Magazine in 2013 by Thomas Murdoch. Some prisoners, we know from later Roman records, survived as slaves in Germanic households for years. A passage in Tacitus's Annals mentions that during a campaign against the Chatti around 50 AD, nearly 40 years after Teutoburg, some survivors of Varus's legions were found still alive in Germanic captivity and liberated. The legionary eagles were captured, all 3 of them the golden aquili of Legio XVII, Legio XVIII, and Legio XIX. These were not merely military trophies. In Roman religious and military tradition, the aquila was the embodied spirit of the legion, a sacred object invested with the honor and the collective identity of thousands of men over years of service. To lose an eagle was the deepest military disgrace Rome recognized. To lose 3 in a single engagement was something without precedent in living memory. In 15 AD, the Roman general Germanicus, nephew of the Emperor Tiberius and one of the most capable military commanders Rome would produce in the 1st century AD, led a punitive expedition back into the territory where Varus's legions had died. He found the battlefield substantially as the dead had left it. Tacitus, whose account of this visit in Annals, Book 1, chapters 60–62, represents the most vivid description of a historical battlefield in all of classical literature, records what Germanicus's soldiers saw. They found, at the site of Varus's first camp, the broad earthwork with its clearly military dimensions. They found the half-destroyed rampart of the last camp, showing where the last pathetic remnant had gathered. And then, on the open ground between these 2 points, they found the bones. Heaped in the open where men had stood and fought, scattered in the undergrowth where they had tried to flee, mixed with the bones of horses and mules, partially decomposed, partially gnawed by animals, whitening in the open air after 6 years of German winters and summers. Skull fragments, rib bones, the long bones of the legs and arms. Near the trees, the rusted iron of weapons that had been thrown down or dropped. In the nearby groves, the altars where prisoners had been killed. Germanicus ordered his men to bury the dead. Tacitus records that the soldiers performed this duty even though they had no way of knowing which bones belonged to whom, not a soldier knowing whether he was interring the relics of a relative or a stranger, but looking on all as kinsfolk and of their own blood. It is one of the most human moments in all of ancient history. Soldiers burying soldiers, years too late, in a forest that had swallowed their predecessors. So completely that the empire had spent 6 years not entirely sure of where to look. They piled the bones into mass graves, and they covered them with earth, and then they marched on. 2 of the 3 captured legionary eagles were eventually recovered in subsequent campaigns by Germanicus and his successors, the eagle of Legio 19. Most recently in 41 AD under Emperor Claudius. The eagle of Legio 18 was never recovered. It remained in Germanic hands, a permanent monument to the autumn of 9 AD, when a column 7 miles long entered a forest and never emerged. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never assigned to new legions. Rome did not reuse them. They were retired from the order of battle permanently, a decision without parallel in Roman military history, signifying that these units were not disbanded or reorganized but simply erased. Their existence was not replaced but removed, as though the empire itself could not bear to see those numbers marching under new standards. As though even the numerals had been contaminated by what happened in the Teutoburg Forest. There are moments in history when the gap between what a civilization believes about itself and what is actually true becomes suddenly, violently visible. These moments are not simply military defeats or political failures. They are something closer to a rupture in reality, a crack in the story. A society has been telling itself for so long that the story had come to feel more solid than stone. The news that arrived in Rome in the late autumn of 9 AD was exactly that kind of rupture. And it arrived, with almost surgical cruelty of timing, on the heels of triumph. Velleius Paterculus records in his Compendium of Roman History that the news of the Teutoburg disaster reached Rome approximately 5 days after the conclusion of the Great Pannonian War, the brutal 3-year campaign in the Balkans that had stretched the empire's military resources to their absolute limit and had finally, exhaustingly, been won. A festival was already being prepared to celebrate that victory. The streets of Rome were in the first stages of celebration. And then the courier arrived from the Rhine frontier with dispatches that no one in the city had the conceptual framework to interpret. Because nothing like this had happened in the memory of anyone alive. 3 legions were gone, not defeated and retreating, not surrounded and negotiating terms, not reduced and reorganized. Gone, the 17, the 18, the 19. Somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 Roman citizens and soldiers and their dependents were erased from the roster of the living in the space of 4 days. In a forest that most Romans could not have located on a map. Their eagles were captured. Their commander died by his own hand. Their bones lying in the mud and rain of a Germanic autumn, unburied, dishonored, beyond retrieval. The festival was cancelled. What happened to Augustus in the days and weeks after this news arrived has been documented by two separate ancient sources with enough specificity and consistency that historians treat it as reliably factual rather than literary embellishment. Suetonius, in his Life of Augustus, in The 12 Caesars, written roughly a century after the events, and Cassius Dio, writing in his Roman History, in the early 3rd century. Both describe the same man doing the same things in the same period. And the portrait they paint together is one of the most psychologically vivid images of grief and shock that ancient literature has preserved for us. Augustus, who was 65 years old in 9 AD and had been ruling Rome in one capacity or another for approximately 4 decades, stopped eating regularly. He let his beard and hair grow without trimming for months, an act of public mourning in Roman religious tradition that communicated to everyone who saw him that he was in a state of extreme, unresolved grief. He reportedly tore his clothing. He wandered the halls of his palace on the Palatine Hill at night, unable to sleep. And in those night wanderings, he would stop and drive his head against the doorposts of the palace. The same physical, self-directed violence that Suetonius records with the matter-of-fact precision of someone writing down a thing that too many people had witnessed to be deniable. And he would cry out, in the darkness, to a dead man. Quintili ver, legiones redi. He observed the anniversary of the disaster every year thereafter as a day of public mourning. Suetonius records this explicitly, noting that Augustus maintained this commemoration for the rest of his life, which continued until 14 AD. Meaning that he marked the anniversary of Teutoburg 5 times before he died, 5 times in which the empire was asked to pause and remember not a victory but a failure. Not a triumph but the single most catastrophic moment of Augustus's long and otherwise largely successful reign. Think about what that tells us. Augustus had built his public identity on an almost unbroken narrative of success. He had defeated Antony and Cleopatra. He had established the Pax Romana. He had reformed the Roman state so thoroughly that generations of later Romans would look back on his reign as a golden age. His public image, maintained across 40 years of carefully managed propaganda in the form of coinage, architecture, literature, and public ceremony, was the image of a man under divine favor. A man whose success was evidence of Rome's destiny and Rome's God's endorsement of that destiny. Teutoburg cracked that image from the inside. Not because it destroyed Rome, because it did not. Not because it ended the empire, because it did not do that either. But because it demonstrated, publicly and irrefutably, that the empire had limits. That there was territory it could not take, a people it could not subdue, a forest it could not civilize. And the man who had built his entire public identity on the premise that Rome was boundless. That Roman destiny was unlimited. That the empire under his guidance was expanding toward something like genuine universality, could not make peace with that knowledge. The grief Suetonius describes is not simply the grief of a general who lost a battle. It is the grief of a man who lost his story. Beyond the palace on the Palatine Hill, the institutional response to the disaster was both immediate and revealing. Cassius Dio records in detail the emergency measures that Augustus ordered in the days and weeks following the news. They tell us, better than any editorial commentary could, just how seriously Rome's leadership took the possibility that the catastrophe in the forest was not the end of the danger but the beginning. Augustus ordered a military emergency across the entire empire. He extended the terms of all provincial governors, a move designed to keep experienced and trusted men in their posts. Rather than cycling them out during a period of crisis, He ordered the conscription of veterans who had already completed their service, which was legally and conventionally unusual enough that Dio remarks on it as evidence of how desperate the situation appeared. When the call for volunteers produced insufficient numbers, he resorted to the lottery selection of men from lists of citizens, again, a measure that spoke to the severity of the emergency. Some men who were selected reportedly mutilated themselves to avoid service. Augustus had these men punished, Dio records, sold into slavery, or otherwise severely dealt with, as a signal that the state's need was not negotiable. He sent Tiberius, his stepson and the most capable general in the imperial family, to the Rhine, with a new army, charged with preventing the disaster from spreading westward. And this tells us what Augustus feared most in the immediate aftermath: not just that 3 legions had been destroyed, but that Arminius and his coalition, emboldened by success and potentially joined by additional tribes who saw opportunity in Rome's weakness, might push across the Rhine into Gaul. And that Gaul, still imperfectly Romanized in its eastern portions, might join the revolt. This fear was not entirely groundless. Arminius, immediately after the victory at Teutoburg, had sent Varus's severed head to Marebodus, the king of the powerful Marcomanni tribe to the southeast, with a message proposing an anti-Roman alliance. If Marebodus had accepted, Rome would have faced the prospect of a coordinated Germanic uprising, stretching from the North Sea to the Danube, covering the entire northern frontier. The strategic implications would have been incalculable. Marebodus declined. He sent Varus's head to Rome for burial, a gesture that functioned simultaneously as a diplomatic signal to Augustus and a statement of his own independence from Arminius's ambitions. He remained neutral throughout the years of conflict that followed. This single decision, made by a Germanic king whose name is barely known today outside of specialist histories, may have saved the Western Roman Empire. Had Marebodus joined the alliance, the scenario Augustus feared might well have come to pass. But he did not, and the Rhine frontier held, and the crisis of 9 AD remained a catastrophe rather than becoming a terminal one. One fort east of the Rhine held through the initial onslaught. Also, most likely located at modern Haltern am See in North Rhine-Westphalia, was garrisoned by Roman troops under the prefect Lucius Caedicius. The fort held against Germanic attack for weeks, possibly months, before the garrison finally broke through the surrounding Germanic forces and retreated to the Rhine. Bellius Paterculus, with evident admiration, records that Caedicius and his men, with the sword, won their way back to their friends. Their resistance bought time for Tiberius to organize the Rhine defense and prevented any immediate Germanic breakthrough into Gaul. In the weeks and months after the disaster, Rome confronted a question that had no comfortable answer and no established protocol. What do you do with a catastrophe of this magnitude in the public record? How does an empire that has defined itself by expansion and divine favor acknowledge that it has been permanently stopped? The Roman response was, characteristically, complex and partially contradictory. On one hand, there was the formal acknowledgment Suetonius records that Augustus established the annual commemoration, which meant that the disaster was not suppressed from public memory but actively maintained within it. Tacitus, writing a century later, treats Teutoburg as a foundational event, whose consequences are still visible in his own time and worthy of extended discussion. The disaster was given a formal Latin name, the Clades Variana. The Varusian disaster, which indexed it within the Roman calendar of catastrophes alongside events like the sack of Rome by the Gauls and the defeat at Cannae. On the other hand, the numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never reassigned. This is the detail that speaks most directly to the emotional and symbolic weight of the event. Because it was a decision that cost Rome nothing materially and accomplished nothing strategically. Renumbering new legions would not have been difficult. Rome had done it before and would do it again with other units. The choice not to reuse those three numbers was not practical. It was psychological. It was an acknowledgement that these were not simply administrative designations but identities, that the men who had carried those eagles had not merely been killed, but that something irreplaceable had been destroyed, and that putting the same numbers on new men would have been a kind of lie that Rome, in this instance, was not willing to tell. Marcus Caelius, the first centurion, the primus pilus, of Legio XVIII, has a memorial stele whose inscription survives today. It was erected by his brother and reads, in part, Marcus Caelius, son of Titus, of the Lemonian tribe, from Bologna, first centurion of the 18th Legion, 53.5 years old, fell in the Varian War. The stele was found at Xanten in Germany, near the Roman fort of Betrayal on the Rhine. It shows Caelius in full ceremonial military dress, wearing his decorations. He is presented not as a man who died in a disaster but as a soldier who fell in a war, with full honors, in full dignity. His brother wanted posterity to know who he was. The stele is in the Rheinisches Landesmuseum in Bonn today. It is one of the most extraordinary personal artifacts to survive from the ancient world. A face put on the abstraction of 20,000 dead. A specific man with a specific age and a specific hometown, 53.5 years old. Killed in the autumn of 9 AD in a forest that no Roman had expected to be a killing ground. He did not die running. He died where he stood. Tiberius arrived on the Rhine in the autumn of 9 AD and spent the following 2 years, 10 and 11 AD, conducting what his biographers describe as cautious operations across the river without any attempt at major offensive action. He made his presence felt. He demonstrated that Rome had not abandoned the frontier, that the empire was still capable of projecting force east of the Rhine if it chose to do so. He did not attempt to reconquer the territory where Varus had marched, and he did not attempt to recover the 3 captured eagles, which were being displayed by the Germanic tribes as trophies of the greatest military victory any of them had ever won. Tiberius was, as a general, exceptionally careful with the lives and resources under his command. He had learned this approach partly from Augustus and partly from his own years of difficult frontier service, and it had served him well. In this situation, caution was probably correct. Rome's available military strength in 10 and 11 AD was not adequate for a major offensive east of the Rhine, particularly given the ongoing need to maintain military presence on other frontiers. He stabilized the situation, prevented its deterioration, and returned to Rome. What he left behind was a frontier that had fundamentally changed its character. Before 9 AD, the Roman presence east of the Rhine had the nature of an advancing occupation, confident in its eventual transformation of the territory into a functioning province. After 9 AD, the presence on the Rhine had the nature of a defensive frontier, organized for the permanent function of keeping the Germanic world out of the Roman world, rather than for the eventual function of absorbing the Germanic world into Rome. When Augustus died in August of 14 AD, 5 years after the disaster in the Teutoburg Forest, he left behind an empire that was still visibly marked by what had happened in that forest. He left behind 3 numbers, 17, 18, and 19, that no one would ever use again. He left behind a Rhine frontier that was organized for defense rather than conquest. He left behind an annual day of mourning that the entire Roman state was expected to observe. And according to Tacitus, writing in his Annals, he left behind a deathbed counsel to his successor, Tiberius, that the empire should be held within its existing boundaries, that the frontiers of Rhine and Danube should be treated not as staging grounds for further expansion but as permanent lines of demarcation. Whether Augustus truly delivered this counsel as formal policy instruction, or whether it was a piece of strategic wisdom attributed to him after the fact by historians, writing in the shadow of his legacy, is something we cannot determine with certainty from surviving sources. What we can determine is what happened next, and what happened next is one of the most instructive episodes in Roman history. About the distance that can exist between what an empire needs to do and what its pride requires it to attempt. Germanicus Julius Caesar was, by the universal testimony of ancient sources, one of the most gifted men of his generation. He was the biological son of the beloved Drusus, who had first pushed Roman power deep into Germanic territory before dying on campaign in 9 BC. And he had been formally adopted by Tiberius in 4 AD, making him simultaneously nephew and adopted son of the new emperor. He had inherited from his father both a genuine talent for military command and something rarer and in many ways more valuable in a leader: the ability to inspire not merely obedience but authentic personal loyalty from the men under him. Bellius Paterculus, writing within living memory of these events, described him as possessed of extraordinary personal qualities, combining martial ability with a modesty and accessibility that distinguished him sharply from most members of the imperial family. He was in his late 20s in 14 AD, young by Roman standards for the level of command he held, but already demonstrably capable. When Augustus died, and Tiberius became emperor, it was Germanicus who commanded the Rhine legions, 8 of them in total. The largest concentration of Roman military power anywhere in the empire. And in the weeks immediately following Augustus's death, those Rhine legions mutinied. The mutiny is the essential context for everything that followed. The legionaries had accumulated legitimate grievances about pay, conditions, and the length of their service, and with the political uncertainty of the transition from Augustus to Tiberius, creating a moment of institutional instability, those grievances erupted into open defiance. Germanicus managed the crisis through a combination of appeals to loyalty, tactical concessions on specific terms of service, and at least one moment of personal theatrical courage that Tacitus records in his Annals, with evident admiration. He reportedly drew his sword before the assembled mutinous legions and offered to fall on it then and there if they would not return to their obedience, daring them either to kill their commander or to prove their loyalty by standing down. The gesture worked, but it had consequences: to redirect the frustrated energy of 8 restless legions and to consolidate his own authority through demonstrated military achievement. Germanicus launched the first of his major campaigns east of the Rhine in the autumn of 14 AD, just weeks after the mutiny was suppressed. He struck against the Marsi tribe, one of the groups that had participated in the Teutoburg coalition. Attacking during the festival season when the warriors were dispersed across their territory, celebrating rather than assembled in defensive formations. The raid was devastating. Tacitus records that a strip of territory 50 miles wide was laid waste, and the Marsi caught entirely unprepared. And in the course of those autumn operations of 14 AD, the first of the 3 captured legionary eagles was recovered. The eagle of Legio XVII was taken from the Marsi in the autumn raids of 14 AD, the first of the 3 sacred standards to come back into Roman hands. This was not simply a military objective. For the men who carried it back across the Rhine, for the officers who received it, for the soldiers who had been living in the shadow of 9 AD for 5 years, the recovery of even one eagle was a moment of extraordinary emotional significance. Think about what that eagle represented to the men standing in the Roman camp when it was brought in. The legionary Aquila was not a piece of military equipment. It was, in Roman religious and military understanding, the living spirit of the legion. The divine presence that dwelt within the unit and sanctified everything the unit did. To lose an eagle was, in Roman belief, the destruction of that spirit. To recover was the beginning of its restoration. 5 years after Teutoburg, one of the 3 stolen identities of the destroyed legions was coming home. The number 17 would never march again. But the eagle had been brought back from the darkness. And that mattered, in ways that the Roman army understood through ceremony and religious conviction rather than through strategic calculation. The following year, 15 AD, brought the second recovery and the moment when Germanicus's soldiers traveled into Germania to find. In the summer campaign of 15 AD, Germanicus's adjutant Lucius Stertinius conducted operations against the Bructeri, the tribe that had been among the most active participants in the Teutoburg coalition. In the course of those operations, in the territory of the Bructeri east of the Rhine, Stertinius's soldiers found the eagle of Legio 19. The second of the 3 stolen standards, the sacred emblem of the legion whose number Rome had already sworn never to reuse, was recovered and brought back to Roman control. Tacitus, in Annals, Book 2, Chapter 25, records the recovery in his characteristically precise prose. 2 eagles back, 1 is still missing. The account of Rome's long reckoning with the Teutoburg disaster was not yet closed, but it was 2/3 settled. That same campaign season of 15 AD brought another moment that Tacitus recorded with the full weight of its historical significance. Germanicus led his army through the forest to the site of the battle itself. This was not a military objective. The Teutoburg killing ground offered no tactical advantage, no enemy to defeat, no province to secure. It was an act of witness, an act of burial. Tacitus describes what Germanicus's soldiers found there 6 years after the killing, and his account, in Annals, Book 1, Chapters 61 and 62, is among the most haunting passages in all of classical literature. They found the first camp that Varus had built, its broad circumference and organized dimensions clearly the work of 3 legions. They found the half-ruined earthwork of the last desperate camp, shrunken, the measurements of exhaustion and diminishment visible in the ground itself. And between these 2 camps, along the miles of forest through which the column had struggled and broken and died, they found the bones. Heaped in the open where men had stood and fought. Scattered in the undergrowth where they had tried to run, bleached and scattered by 6 winters and 6 summers, mixed with the bones of horses and mules and the rusted remnants of weapons and armor. In the trees of the surrounding forest, the shapes that had been men who were taken alive and killed in sacrifice according to Germanic religious practice. Tacitus does not dwell on the horror. He records it with the spare factual directness of a historian who trusts the material to speak. Germanicus ordered his army to bury the dead. Tacitus records that the soldiers performed this duty even though they could not know which bones belonged to which man, looking upon all as kinsfolk and of their own blood, in the words that have come down through 2,000 years without losing any of their force. They piled the bones into mass graves, covered them with earth, and a Roman officer placed the first sod with his own hands to inaugurate the burial mound. Germanicus also placed the first stone of a turf memorial at the site. Tiberius later had this memorial removed, which Tacitus records with evident displeasure, noting that the emperor explained that the action risked giving the impression that Rome still felt the wound. What Tiberius may really have been managing was more subtle. The political optics of a still unresolved defeat being publicly commemorated by a general who was becoming dangerously popular with his army. While these military and ceremonial events were unfolding, a personal encounter took place on the banks of the Weser River. That Tacitus records because it crystallizes, in a few spoken sentences, the entire human architecture of this story. Arminius was on the eastern bank. His brother Flavius, who had continued to serve in the Roman auxiliary cavalry through all of it, through the years of Arminius's conspiracy, through the Teutoburg disaster itself, through the campaigns that followed, was on the western bank with Germanicus's forces. Tacitus tells us they called to each other across the water, the river between them serving as the most literal possible image of everything else that divided them. Flavius, at approximately 34 years old, in Roman auxiliary cavalry officer dress, and the empty left eye socket, covered by a military leather patch, that marked where his Roman service had cost him an eye in some earlier engagement. He spoke about Rome, about the rewards he had received, about the rank and the decorations, about the honor that came from faithful service to the greatest power in the world. He showed his missing eye as evidence, not of what he had lost but of what his loyalty had cost and what he had paid willingly. He spoke about Roman power and the futility of continuing to fight it. Arminius responded with everything that was on the other side of that calculation. The freedom of his own people, the dignity of self-governance, the gods of their fathers, the dishonor of fighting against one's own blood. Tacitus records the exchange in indirect speech, and the language gap between the brothers, requiring interpreters, is itself a detail of extraordinary biographical poignancy. Two men who left the same tribal settlement as children together and were rebuilt in the same foreign city, now required translators to speak to each other across 30 meters of river. The exchange ended badly, Tacitus says, when Arminius's words became sharp enough to demand a physical response, and the Roman officers had to restrain Flavius from attempting to swim the river to confront his brother directly. They were not simply two brothers fighting about a family dispute. They were two answers to an impossible question, standing on opposite banks and shouting at each other across the water that ran between them. In 16 AD, Germanicus's third campaign season east of the Rhine produced the encounter that Rome had been trying to engineer since 9 AD, a major set-piece battle with Arminius in open terrain, the kind of terrain where Roman tactical doctrine functioned as designed and Roman numerical and organizational superiority could be brought fully to bear. The battle was fought at Idistaviso, a plain on the east bank of the Weser River in what is today central Lower Saxony. Tacitus describes the terrain in Annals, Book 2. The plain had a slight curve to it, hemmed by forest on both sides, the river behind the Roman positions. The Germanic warriors took positions on the slope of the forest edge and in the trees. Arminius attempting to use elevated terrain in a way that echoed, on a smaller scale, the advantages he had exploited at Teutoburg. But Germanicus had learned. His cavalry swept around the Germanic flanks, his infantry held their ground and refused to be drawn into the trees. And when the Germanic warriors attempted their customary tactic of charging and withdrawing, they found the Roman formations absorbing the charge and counter-attacking with a coherence that the Teutoburg situation had made impossible. Arminius was present and fighting, and Tacitus records that he was wounded during the battle, a wound that may have limited his effectiveness in command. The Germanic coalition was driven from the field with serious casualties. A second battle, at the wall of the Angravary on a fortified earthwork west of modern Hanover, repeated the result. Disciplined Roman tactical superiority in open and moderately open terrain, overwhelming Germanic warriors, who had been denied the specific advantages of forest, narrow paths, and surprise that had made Teutoburg possible. 2 victories. 2 eagles recovered. Arminius was wounded and retreating. By any conventional measure of ancient military success, Germanicus's 3 campaign seasons east of the Rhine had achieved their objectives. Then Tiberius recalled him. The emperor's calculation. 17 AD. This is the moment in the story that historians and observers, both ancient and modern, have found most difficult to adjudicate with confidence, because the argument runs genuinely in both directions and the available evidence cannot resolve it. Tiberius's stated case, as Tacitus records it with unconcealed hostility in the Annals, was essentially strategic. The campaigns had been successful, but at very high cost in men, money, and logistical resources. The Rhine was a more defensible and more easily supplied frontier than any line that could be maintained further east. The Germanic tribes, left without the external pressure of Roman military operations to unite them, would revert to fighting among themselves, which would neutralize them as a threat without requiring Rome to spend further blood and treasure on their reduction. And Germania, as a province, would generate insufficient revenue to justify the cost of its permanent occupation and defense. These arguments were not unreasonable. Modern military historians and classicists who have analyzed the logistics of the Germanic campaigns have generally concluded that Tiberius's strategic assessment was essentially correct on the material terms. The Rhine was genuinely the most defensible line available. The cost-benefit calculation for full conquest of the Germanic territories was genuinely unfavorable. And the Germanic tribes did, precisely as Tiberius predicted, revert to internal conflict once Roman military pressure was removed. Tacitus, who admired Germanicus extravagantly and whose portrait of Tiberius is among the most devastatingly hostile in classical literature, does not dispute the strategic logic. He disputes the motivation. He argues that Tiberius's primary concern was not strategic but personal, that Germanicus, popular with his legions to a degree that went beyond the normal officer-soldier relationship, celebrated in Rome as the heir to Augustus's own military legacy, was becoming a political danger that Tiberius preferred to remove from the Rhine before it ripened into something unmanageable. That jealousy and fear, dressed in the respectable clothing of strategy, is what recalled Germanicus to Rome in 17 AD. The truth of Tiberius's interior motivation is, 2,000 years later, simply not recoverable. What is recoverable is the outcome. Germanicus was recalled. He celebrated a magnificent triumph in Rome on May 26, 17 AD, one of the grandest spectacles of Tiberius's reign. 2 legionary eagles were displayed in the procession. Walking among the displayed captives of the Germanic campaigns was the Snelda, Arminius's wife, captured in the spring of 15 AD, accompanied by her son Thumelicus, who was at this point approximately 2 years old, a fair-haired, wide-eyed child who had been born into Roman captivity and was now being paraded through streets he had never seen, in a city he did not know, as a symbol of something he was far too young to understand. The Snelda's bearing in the procession is noted by Tacitus. She walked with her eyes cast down, neither appealing to the crowd nor defying it. Whether this was pride, despair, or simply a woman conserving her strength for whatever came next? Tacitus does not say. She and her son were sent to Ravenna after the triumph. Thumelicus grew up there and trained as a gladiator. Tacitus promised to record his eventual fate, but the relevant section of the Annals is lost to us. Most scholars, reasoning from the silence of later sources and the timing, believe he died in the arena around 30 or 31 AD, at approximately 15 or 16 years old. Arminius never saw him. The son of the man who stopped Rome at the Rhine died performing for Roman crowds in an Italian city, with no one left to tell him who his father was. The triumph was magnificent. It changed nothing east of the Rhine. The third eagle, 41 AD. The account finally closed. For 25 years after Germanicus's triumph and the display of 2 recovered eagles, the third eagle, the Aquila of Legio XVIII, remained in Germanic hands. It was the last open wound, the last piece of evidence that the account of Teutoburg had not been fully settled. The one remaining symbol of the autumn of 9 AD that Rome had not yet reclaimed. In 41 AD, under the Emperor Claudius, the brother of Germanicus, a Roman commander named Publius Gabinius Secundus conducted military operations against the Chauci tribe in northwestern Germania. Cassius Dio records in Roman History, Book 60, Chapter 8, that in the course of these operations, the eagle of Legio XVIII was recovered from the Chauci. Gabinius was awarded the honorific cognomen Chaucius for this achievement, a name that recorded for posterity both the operation and the tribe from which the eagle had been taken. With that recovery, 32 years after the battle, the last of the 3 eagles was back in Roman hands. All 3 had been returned. Cassius Dio and the Varus March archaeological record both confirm that the recovered eagles were placed in the Temple of Mars Ultor, the Temple of Mars the Avenger, in the Forum of Augustus, which had been dedicated specifically to commemorate the restoration of Roman military honor in cases of lost standards. Augustus had built the temple partly in fulfillment of a vow made before the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. The 3 eagles of Teutoburg, joining the other restored standards in that temple, were a statement of Roman symbolic completion. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were still never reused. The recovery of the eagles did not restore the legions. It restored Roman honor, in Roman religious and military understanding. But it did not undo the decision that those 3 numbers would be carried by no new men under new standards. That decision, made in the grief and shock of the autumn of 9 AD, was permanent. It remains permanent. There is no Roman Legio 17, 18, or 19 in any later period of Roman history. The 3 numbers stand in the Roman order of battle like 3 empty chairs at a table that has been set for everyone else. A silence that speaks continuously and will not be resolved. In the decades following Germanicus's recall and the definitive abandonment of the effort to conquer Germania, the Roman Empire undertook one of the most ambitious engineering projects in its history, the construction of the Limes Germanicus, the Germanic frontier fortification system, which expressed Rome's new strategic posture in materials more permanent than any official decree. In its completed form, as built and elaborated across the century and a half following Teutoburg, the Limes Germanicus ran for approximately 568 kilometers from the Rhine at Rheinbrohl in the north to the Danube near Regensburg in the south, cutting across the angle between the 2 great rivers and establishing the permanent boundary between the Roman world and the world Rome had decided it could not absorb. The system comprised approximately 900 watchtowers, spaced close enough that each tower was visible to the next. Approximately 60 auxiliary forts positioned along the military road that ran the full length of the frontier, and a network of larger legionary bases further back, providing the military reserve that could respond to any serious breach. This represented a permanent garrisoning of some 50,000 soldiers along the frontier line alone, a significant fraction of Rome's total military strength at any given period, dedicated exclusively to the function of holding a line that the empire had decided it could not advance beyond. It was, in the most literal structural sense possible, an admission built in stone and timber and packed earth. Here is where Rome stops. Not temporarily, not pending a future campaign. Permanently. Parts of the Limes Germanicus are a UNESCO World Heritage Site today, designated in 2005 as part of the Frontiers of the Roman Empire World Heritage Property. You can walk sections of it. You can stand at a watchtower site and look northeast into the territory that Rome spent 4 decades trying to organize into a province and ultimately decided to leave alone. And the scale of the physical investment in that decision communicates something that no written source quite captures. This was not a reluctant retreat. By the time the Limes was complete, it was a statement of permanent intent, a civilization's considered verdict on where it ended and what lay beyond. While Rome was constructing its permanent border and processing the long aftermath of Teutoburg, Arminius was discovering something that military commanders who achieve spectacular victories often discover in the years that follow. Winning the battle was the achievable part, and the political challenge of building something durable from the victory was the part that exceeded his reach. He had stopped Rome, let us say that plainly and without qualification, because it deserves to be said. He had done something that no Germanic leader before him had achieved and that none would achieve again for centuries. He had inflicted on the greatest military organization in the Western world a defeat so complete and so psychologically profound that it permanently redirected the empire's strategic ambitions. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing roughly a century later, and drawing on sources that were within living memory of the events, rendered his verdict on Arminius in the closing lines of Annals, Book 2, with a compression and precision that has not been improved upon in 2,000 years. Liberator had ubi Germania. Without doubt, the liberator of Germania. He had challenged Rome not in its weakness, Tacitus wrote, not in its infancy or its periods of crisis, but at the absolute height of its confidence and its power, and he had not been defeated in the war even when he lost individual battles. But what he could not build was a state. The coalition of tribes that had assembled for Teutoburg dissolved almost immediately after the victory, its components returning to their customary patterns of internal rivalry and competition, with the predictability of water finding its own level. The Germanic political structure was organized around tribes and clans and the personal authority of individual leaders within those units. It had no institutional framework for the kind of centralized coordination that would have transformed a military coalition into a permanent political entity. Arminius could call the tribes to fight together, once, against a common enemy who had made their situation dire enough to overcome the gravitational pull of their mutual grievances. He could not create, from the material of that alliance, a governing structure that outlasted the specific military emergency that had produced it. His father-in-law, Segestes, the man who had tried to warn Varus and whose daughter Arminius had taken against his wishes, had escaped to Roman protection in 15 AD during Germanicus's spring campaign, taking the Snelda with him. He would live out his days under Roman patronage. Arminius fought Germanicus's forces through 3 campaign seasons, suffering defeats at Idestaviso and the Wall of the Angraveri in 16 AD but preserving his military force and his strategic position, winning the war. Even as he lost the battles by simply surviving until Rome decided to stop pushing. When Germanicus was recalled in 17 AD, Arminius had, in the most fundamental strategic sense, won again. The pressure lifted, but the coalition had no purpose without the pressure to maintain it, and it dissolved accordingly. In 17 or 18 AD, Arminius fought a major conflict against Maroboduus, the Marcomanni king, who had declined his post-Teutoburg alliance offer and sent Varus's head to Rome for burial. The war was inconclusive. Maroboduus was eventually driven from power by internal opposition among his own people and fled to Roman protection, where Tiberius allowed him to live in comfortable retirement at Ravenna for the remaining 18 years of his life. A Germanic king housed and fed by the empire he had chosen not to fight. Arminius had outlasted and outfought his greatest Germanic rival, but he had gained no territory and built no institution from the victory. Then, in 19 AD, Germanicus died in Antioch under circumstances that Tacitus describes with careful, pointed ambiguity, recording the widespread belief that he had been poisoned by his enemies in the imperial court. The one Roman commander who had actually defeated Arminius in the open field was dead. Whatever campaign Germanicus might have returned to lead was never led. 2 years later, in 21 AD, Arminius was dead as well. He was not killed by a Roman sword. He was not captured or defeated. He was murdered by members of his own Cheruscan tribe, men of the noble families, who had decided that his personal authority had grown beyond what the tribal political framework could accommodate, that the man who had stopped Rome was accumulating the kind of centralized power that threatened the traditional distribution of aristocratic authority within the Cheruscan structure. Tacitus records the death in a single brief passage, without dramatic embellishment, noting only that he was betrayed by his relatives. The tribe's immune response to the concentration of power in one man's hands killed the man who had done more than any other individual to preserve the tribe's independence. The irony is of the specific kind that history generates occasionally, where the very strength that makes a man indispensable also makes him, in the end, untenable. He was 37 or 38 years old. Tiberius, earlier in Arminius's career, had refused an offer from a chatty chieftain to assassinate Arminius by poison on Rome's behalf. His stated reason, as Tacitus records it in the Annals, is one of the most extraordinary sentences in ancient literature. Rome avenged itself on its enemies, not through secret treachery but openly and by arms. Whether this was a principle or a political calculation or the specific pride of an emperor who wanted Arminius defeated by Roman soldiers or not at all, the words have traveled 2,000 years with full force and tact. Tiberius refused the poison. His own people did not refuse. The Rhine, after Teutoburg, was not simply a military frontier. It was a civilizational boundary, and its consequences are visible 15 centuries after the last Roman soldier left the limes, if you know how to read the landscape. On the western side of the Rhine, Latin evolved into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. Roman law became the foundation of legal and administrative systems across the entire Western Mediterranean world and its Atlantic extensions. Roman Christianity, transmitted through the institutional architecture of the Roman Church, shaped religion, education, governance, and the organization of time itself. The city plans of London, Paris, Vienna, Lyon, Cologne, and dozens of other major European cities still carry the fingerprints of Roman urban design in their street patterns and civic spaces. On the eastern side of the Rhine, Germanic languages survived and evolved without Roman overlay, eventually producing German, Dutch, English, the Scandinavian languages, and their descendants. Germanic legal customs, modified across centuries, remained the foundation of social and political organization, in a way that produced different assumptions about the relationship between the individual, the community, and authority than the Roman tradition generated. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, it was the Germanic peoples who moved into the vacuum and built the kingdoms that eventually became the modern nations of Europe. And they built them from a cultural inheritance that the Rhine frontier had protected from complete Roman absorption for 400 years. The linguistic line that separates the Romance language world from the Germanic language world in contemporary Europe, running roughly through what is today Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and northern Italy, corresponds with remarkable fidelity to the line of the Rhine and Danube frontier. This is not a coincidence. It is the direct consequence, still legible in the mouths and legal codes and political traditions of living people, of a decision made in a forest in September of 9 AD by a man who had been trained in Rome to serve Rome and chose instead to serve his own people. A defeat that lasted 4 days shaped a continent for 2,000 years. Near the city of Detmold in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany, a colossal statue stands on one of the forested hills of the Teutoburg region. Ernst von Bandel's Hermannsdenkmal, completed and unveiled in 1875 at the height of the German nationalist movement that preceded and accompanied Bismarck's unification of the German states, stands 27 meters tall on a rotunda. That brings the total height of the monument above the surrounding landscape to 54 meters. The figure holds a sword raised toward the west, toward Rome, toward France, toward the recurring enemies of 19th-century German political imagination. The blade bears the inscription, Deutsche Einigkeit meine Stark Deutschlands matched. German unity is my strength is Germany's power. The 19th-century Germans who built that statue called the figure Hermann, the German linguistic evolution of Arminius that had circulated in nationalist literature since at least Klopstock's dramatic trilogy of 1769. And they made him into the founding myth of German national identity, the first German hero, the father of the nation, the man who kept Germany German at the moment when Roman civilization threatened to absorb it entirely. The historical Arminius was considerably more complicated than the bronze figure on the hilltop suggests. As the historical reality always is when a nation reaches backward into the past and finds there the hero it needs. He did not think of himself as German. The concept of German national identity did not exist in 9 AD and would not exist for another 18 centuries. He was Cheruscan, the son of Segamer, the child who had been sent to Rome at 7 or 8 years old and spent 20 years being remade from the inside, and who chose, at a specific moment, to unmake the remade self and return to the original. What he was protecting was his tribe, not a nation. What he was building was a coalition, not a state. What he achieved was the stopping of an empire, not the founding of a civilization. But the consequences of what he achieved were civilizational, regardless of his intent. The forest that swallowed 3 Roman legions in September of 9 AD created, in its aftermath, the linguistic and cultural divide that still organizes the map of Europe. That is not what Arminius planned. It is what happened, and it is enough. There is a question that has followed this entire story from its first sentence. A question that we have been circling without quite answering. and it deserves to be addressed directly now, at the end, because it is the question that gives this story its meaning. Not just its historical meaning, but its human meaning, the kind of meaning that makes a 2,000-year-old story feel immediate and personal and unfinished. It seems, on the surface, like a question with an obvious answer. He destroyed 3 Roman legions. He stopped the expansion of the greatest empire the Western world had ever produced. He held his ground against Germanicus, the finest Roman general of his generation, through 3 grueling campaign seasons, and when Germanicus was recalled and the campaigns ended, it was Rome that had retreated and Arminius who remained standing in his own forest. The Rhine became a permanent frontier. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were retired forever. Augustus died haunted by what had happened. 2,000 years later, the name Teutoburg is still synonymous with one of the most consequential military upsets in human history. By every conventional measure of military and strategic success, yes, he won. And yet, when Arminius died in 21 AD, murdered by members of his own Cheruscan tribe, who had decided he was accumulating too much personal authority for the tribal political structure to contain, he was 37 or 38 years old. Still in the prime of his life by any reasonable estimate, and he left behind a landscape that looked almost nothing like the one he might have imagined. When he turned his horse around in the forest in September of 9 AD and rode back toward his people, there was no unified Germanic nation. There was no permanent alliance of tribes, no institutional structure that could coordinate the Germanic world against future Roman pressure or against any other external threat. The coalition that he had assembled for Teutoburg, the extraordinary diplomatic achievement of convincing 6 rival tribes to suppress their mutual grievances and fight together as a single military force, had dissolved almost immediately after the victory. Its components returning to their customary patterns of rivalry and competition as predictably as water returns to its natural level after you remove the vessel that was containing it. The Germanic world after Teutoburg was, politically and institutionally, essentially the same fragmented, decentralized, tribal world it had been before Teutoburg. Except that Rome was no longer trying to absorb it and had instead settled for containing it. His wife the Snelda had been captured by Germanicus's forces in 15 AD, while she was pregnant with their child, and had been displayed in the triumphal procession through Rome in 17 AD. The living prize of a victor's parade, dressed in Germanic clothing to emphasize her foreignness. Walking through streets lined with Romans celebrating what they chose to call a victory over the man who had refused to be defeated. His son, born in Roman captivity, raised in Roman Ravenna, named Thumelicus, a name that sounds Germanic, but was recorded for us only in Latin, grew up without a father and without a people, and disappears from the historical record in early childhood, his fate unknown. Arminius never held the boy. He never heard his voice. His father-in-law, Segustes, the man who had tried to warn Varus and whose warning Varus had dismissed, had escaped to Roman protection and lived out his years under Roman patronage. His brother Flavius, the fair-haired one who had chosen Rome absolutely and completely, continued to serve in the Roman military and outlived his brother, dying of causes the sources do not specify in Roman service, far from the Cheruscan forests where they had both been born. The 2 boys who had crossed the Rhine together as children, who had been rebuilt from the inside by the most sophisticated empire on earth, had ended up on opposite sides of every possible divide, and neither side had given them what they most needed. Arminius had his victory and his people and his forest, and lost his wife and his son and his life at 38. Flavius had his rank and his pension and his Roman citizenship, and lost his eye and his brother, and whatever remained of the self he had been before Rome got hold of him. Neither of them won the version of the story where winning feels like winning. Tacitus wrote his obituary of Arminius at the end of the second book of the Annals, and it remains, 2,000 years later, one of the most compressed and resonant assessments in all of ancient historiography. His exact Latin words were, Liberator haud dubi Germania. Without doubt, the liberator of Germania. He wrote that Arminius had not challenged Rome in its infancy or in a period of weakness, as other enemies had done before him, but at the height of its power, in the full bloom of the empire. When Rome was at the absolute peak of its confidence and its military capacity. He wrote that Arminius had fought battles with varying success but had remained undefeated in war. Which is the critical distinction. You can lose individual engagements and still win the strategic contest, and Arminius had done exactly that. He wrote that the tribes still sang of him in Tacitus's own time, roughly a century after his death, meaning that his memory had not faded into the archaeology of a forgotten conflict but was still living in the oral tradition of the people he had fought for. And then Tacitus added the sentence that carries the sharpest edge of all. He noted that Arminius remained unknown to Greek and Roman writers, which is to say, that the man who had inflicted on Rome its most psychologically devastating military defeat in a century had not been given the literary celebration that Rome routinely lavished on its own heroes and even on enemies it found worthy of respect. There were no Roman epics about Arminius. No Roman poets had taken up his story and given it the kind of immortality that Virgil gave to Aeneas, or that later writers would give to Hannibal. He had been too dangerous, his victory too raw, the wound too recent and too unhealed for Rome to do what it normally did with worthy enemies, which was to absorb them into Roman narrative and domesticate them into proof of Roman greatness. Rome could celebrate enemies it had eventually defeated, because eventually defeating them proved Roman destiny. It could not celebrate an enemy it had not defeated, an enemy whose essential victory was still sitting on the other side of the Rhine frontier, in the form of unconquered territory and uncollected taxes and 3 numbers that would never march under eagles again. So instead of epic poems, Arminius got silence, and in a culture that measured immortality in text, that silence was itself a kind of verdict. 1800 years after Arminius died in the Cheruscan forests, a German sculptor named Ernst von Bandel began construction of a monument that would eventually become the largest statue in Germany. He began work in 1838, during the period of rising German nationalism that preceded Bismarck's unification of the German states into a single nation. And the monument was completed and unveiled in 1875, 4 years after that. Unification was achieved, in a ceremony that was explicitly framed as a celebration of the newly unified German nation. The statue stands 27 meters tall. The entire monument, including the base and the rotunda below it, reaches 54 meters above the surrounding Teutoburg hills. The figure holds a sword raised toward the sky, and the blade bears an inscription, Deutsche Einigkeit meine Stark Deutschland's matched. German unity is my strength is Germany's power. The figure faces west, toward Rome, toward France, toward the national enemies of 19th-century German imagination. Its posture one of permanent, defiant vigilance. The 19th-century Germans who built that statue called the figure Hermann. The German rendering of Arminius that had been circulating in nationalist literature since at least the 18th century, when Friedrich Gottlieb Klopstock wrote his dramatic trilogy, Hermann's Battle, in 1769, and Heinrich von Kleist wrote his own drama, The Battle of Hermann, in 1808. In these works, Arminius had been transformed into something quite different from the historical figure Tacitus described, into a proto-nationalist hero, the first German. The founder of a national identity, the man who had kept Germany German at the moment when Roman civilization threatened to absorb it entirely. The historical reality, as we have seen across the preceding chapters, was considerably more complicated. Arminius did not think of himself as German in any sense that the 19th century would have recognized. The concept of a unified German national identity did not exist in 9 AD. What existed were tribes Cherusci, Bructeri, Marsi, Chatti, dozens of others. Each with its own leadership structure, its own territory, its own history of alliances and conflicts with its neighbors. Arminius was the Cherusci first, last, and always. His coalition was a military alliance forged for a specific purpose, and when the purpose was achieved, the coalition dissolved, because there was nothing deeper than the immediate strategic interest holding it together. But the 19th century needed a founding myth, and Arminius, or Hermann, filled the role that history had conveniently left open. The statue was not a monument to the historical Arminius. It was a monument to a national need, to the desire of a fragmentary collection of German-speaking states to find, in the deep past, evidence that they had always been a unified people, that their unity was not a recent political construction but an ancient organic truth. It was, in a sense, the same kind of projection that Augustus had performed in the opposite direction. The same mapping of present desires onto a past that was more complicated than the present required it to be. And yet, the statue stands. And it is not wrong about everything. Whatever Arminius was or was not in historical fact, whatever he did or did not intend by what he did in that forest, the consequences were real, and they were lasting, and they did shape the world the statue looks out over. The Germanic world survived as a distinct cultural and linguistic sphere. The Rhine held as a frontier. The Europe that eventually emerged from the long darkness after Rome's fall was shaped by the divide that Teutoburg had helped establish and maintain, shaped by the fact that there were Germanic languages and Roman languages, Germanic legal traditions and Roman legal traditions, Germanic political cultures and Roman political cultures. All of them products of the line that ran along a river in Germany and that had been drawn, in its essential character, by 4 days of rain and ambush and mud in the autumn of 9 AD. There is a reason this story does not release you easily. There is a reason that 2,000 years of distance does not make it feel safe, historical, and does not allow you to process it as simply an interesting data point in the long record of military history. It stays with you because of the people in it, because of the specific human weight of the specific choices that specific individuals made. You think about Augustus, 65 years old, a man who had achieved more by any reasonable measure than any human being alive at his moment in history. Walking the halls of his palace at night and driving his head against the doorposts, crying out to a dead man in the darkness. You think about what it means to build something for a lifetime and discover, at the end of it, that you had been building on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. You think about Varus, not as the fool that Velleius Paterculus so contemptuously painted him, but as something more recognizable and more disturbing, a competent and experienced man who had a model of the world that had served him well for a long time, and who could not, in the end, update that model when the evidence demanded it. He had been told, directly, by a credible person, that his trusted advisor was planning to destroy him. He chose not to believe it because believing it would have required him to revise everything else he believed. And the cost of that revision felt, in the moment, greater than the cost of maintaining the comfortable fiction. Most of us have made that calculation at least once. Most of us have been lucky enough that the cost was not 20,000 lives. You think about Flavius, the fair-haired one, the brother who chose Rome and lost an eye for it, and crossed a river and shouted at his brother across the water and went home to his Roman pension and his Roman rank and whatever peace he was able to make with all of it. Nobody writes epics about the people who make the conventional choice. Nobody builds 54-meter monuments to the ones who stayed. But Flavius was real, and his choice was real, and the wound in his eye socket was real. And the thing he and his brother had between them before Rome got involved was real too, and then it was gone. You think about this Snelda, walking through the streets of Rome in a triumphal procession while the crowd cheered the general who had captured her, carrying a child who would grow up in a city she had never chosen and disappear from the record before he was old enough to understand what had been taken from him. Ancient sources do not spend much time with the Snelda. They rarely spend much time with anyone who is not a general, an emperor, or a man of sufficient status to generate a paper trail. But she was there. She walked through those streets. She heard that crowd. And you think about Arminius himself, the figure at the center of all of it, the man who was never fully Roman and never fully Cheruscan after Rome was done with him, who lived between two worlds for his entire adult life and who resolved that impossible position by choosing one world and destroying the other, and who discovered in the end that the world he had chosen could not quite contain him either. He had been too Roman for the Germanic political structure that killed him, too Germanic for the Roman literary tradition that erased him. He was, as Tacitus understood with the precision of a great historian, a man who fit nowhere completely, whose power came precisely from his ability to move between worlds, and whose tragedy was that the movement was one way. He could leave Rome. He could not unlearn what Rome had taught him. He could fight for his people. He could not build for them what Rome had built for itself. He could stop the empire at the Rhine. He could not create, east of the Rhine, an alternative order that gave his victory the institutional permanence that would have made it last. He won the battle. He lost the peace. And 12 years after the forest, the people he had saved from Rome took his life in the night, and the tribes went back to fighting each other, and the forest was quiet again. Near Kalkries Hill in Lower Saxony, Germany, where the most concentrated archaeological evidence of the Teutoburg disaster has been found, there is a museum and a park where you can walk the ground. The Verurschlag Museum und Park, as it is formally known, opened in 2002 on the 1500th anniversary of the bottle's rediscovery by modern archaeology. You can see the recovered artifacts, the legionary armor, the coins, stamped VAR, the cavalry parade mask that was found face up in the earth as though its owner had simply set it down for a moment and walked away. You can walk to the edge of the reconstructed Germanic rampart and look out over the flat, boggy ground to the north and understand, standing there in the physical geography, exactly why the Romans could not get through. The museum is excellent and scrupulously careful. It does not tell you that Arminius was a German national hero. It does not tell you that Rome deserved what happened. It tells you, with the careful honesty of good historical scholarship, what the evidence shows and where the evidence ends and the interpretation begins. It acknowledges what is known and what is not known, what can be confirmed by the objects in the ground, and what remains in the territory of inference and imagination. It is the right way to tell this story. Nearby, in the Teutoburg Hills, The Hermannsdenkmal still stands. Ernst von Bandel's colossal figure still raises his sword toward the west. The blade still bears the inscription about German unity and German strength. The statue is a monument to a need that Germany felt in 1875, and whatever we think about the accuracy of the historical portrait it presents, the need was real. And the monument is beautiful in the way that sincere, large-scale human aspiration is always beautiful, even when it oversimplifies. But the most honest monument to Arminius is not the statue. It is the Rhine itself. It is the line of the river, running from the Alps to the North Sea, marking the boundary between the world that Rome made and the world that Rome could not enter. It is the fact that on one side of that river, the languages descended from Latin, and on the other side, the languages descended from Germanic, and that the line between them is still visible today in the political and cultural geography of Europe. It is the fact that three numbers, 17, 18, and 19, were never assigned again. It is the fact that an emperor cried out in the night to a dead man, and that cry has been echoing for 2,000 years and has not yet fully died away. And somewhere, in the soil of a German field that a farmer is plowing this autumn, one more coin or buckle or sandal nail from the column of Publius Quinctilius Varus is working its way to the surface, frost by frost, season by season, patient as the forest that swallowed it and never gave it back. It will be found by someone who will understand what it is. And for a moment, the autumn of 9 AD will be present again. The rain and the mud and the trees and the silence after the last cry, and the story will be exactly as alive as it has always been.